So really the truth is any amount of protein you're eating is going to get absorbed. And when I mean absorbed, it's going to be broken down and taken into your circulatory system to be used throughout your body.
Hey guys, it's Cori from Redefining Strength. Welcome to the Fitness Hacks Podcast. Today we're going to talk about some fun nutrition and exercise myths, and we're going to debunk them. There are a lot of different perspectives when it comes to how you should approach your nutrition, how you should approach your workouts. And while I don't like to demonize anything, I think it's really key we understand the why behind things, what might work, what might not be as valuable, and where some of the myths are really coming from. So in this episode, I want to talk about the mindset that creates the fitness and nutrition environment that really fosters these myths. I then want to touch on 5 dietary myths with Michelle, and she's going to debunk them for us. Then we'll talk about the myth of a sustainable lifestyle and what really creating a lifestyle means. And then at the end, I want to go over 5 of my favorite training myths and why they came about and what you should really do about them. So let's jump right in. So I want to talk about our current fitness and nutrition environment and the demonization of things that has come about. Also, this feeling of information overload that we can have. There's this belief that there's a right and wrong way to do everything in fitness, and really there's so many opportunities, all the diversity of things out there. And it can be hard to see it in that way when someone very much says this is right and this is wrong, right? We've become very cult-like in our attitudes. But we have to realize that there is opportunity with so much out there, because even things like being gluten or dairy-free, they stem from a very purposeful place. But the problem is they become generalized for people that don't need them. So if we are going to eliminate something, use a specific approach, we want to understand why it's being implemented and who it might be best for. Because when we understand the why, the what, the how, all those different things behind these different diets, these different workout approaches, we can really find what works for us and see opportunity in everything. Because all these things have come about because they have worked for somebody. The problem is that they hit, mainstream media, they become generalized for everybody when they had a specific purpose. So as you're approaching different things, looking at what's right and what's wrong, looking at different myths, instead of just writing something off or saying something is bad, find the opportunity in all these different perspectives to really select what works for you. But also don't be afraid to say, hey, I don't have to demonize these things because I don't have these health concerns. I don't have an issue with gluten. I don't have an issue with dairy. I don't have an issue with carbs. Or even, hey, my activity level means more carbs are right for me. We have to really assess who and what we are, and also assess why something might have worked for somebody and why it might not work for us. And I think that question is one of the most powerful questions we can ask ourselves when we're really looking at everything out there is why. Why does this work? Why has this been promoted? Why might not it work for me? But just stop the general demonization. Stop letting your identity be caught up in the diet that you're doing or the workout routine that you're doing. Because as much as something might even be good, as much as you might really believe in it now, what you actually need might change over the course of your life, because our body, our needs, our goals, our lifestyle are constantly evolving, and nothing is going to be standing still. And therefore we need to be open to seeing opportunities as our needs and goals change. So stop the demonization. Don't fall into having this cult-like attitude when it comes to things in fitness and nutrition, but see the opportunity. And I even like to argue with myself. If I say, no, I don't like that, all of a sudden I'll start going into, well, it could work for this reason or that reason, or this might be a reason to test it out. And I find that while sometimes annoying, also allows me to be open to new perspectives to keep moving forward and learning and growing myself. So stop the demonization, stop believing there's one right or one wrong way, and see opportunity in everything. All right, I'm super excited to jump in with Michelle and talk about dieting myths and how we can avoid falling prey to them. So Michelle, what is the top dieting myth, and 5 top dieting myths even, that you see occurring, and how can people avoid falling for these?
Well, first and foremost, I feel like it's not going to be a big surprise, but we have to address carbs. There's so many people out there that still believe carbs make you fat. And part of this continues to be kind of the narrative, because we always are affronted with tons of diets that are preaching low carb. And while there are appropriate reasons to kind of decrease our carb intake, the reason behind it isn't quite as scientific backed as a lot of people believe. So the storyline really comes down to a lot of people believe that carbs make you fat. And carbs alone do not actually make you fat. So the reason why we kind of fall victim to this narrative is really because there are some poorer carb choices out there than others. So we're really talking about the simple carbs that are going to be, more like your sodas, your chips, your candy. And of course, those are going to be less nutrient dense. So it does kind of make sense why people tend to demonize carbs as a whole, as a category. However, if it was the simple equation that carb equals insulin secretion, which increases fat storage, then therefore carbs must make you fat. But like anything with nutrition, it really isn't that simple.
I think we often have that association, or I see people coming in with that association too, because they've gone on a low carb diet and they instantly see changes on the scale. And it's like, well, yes, you've depleted your glycogen stores, you've lost water weight, but it's not actually fat being lost. But I think those instant wins can make us think, oh, cut my carbs, I lose weight, therefore I'm losing fat.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people only want to use the scale as a determination of health when there's so much more than just the scale to determine health. I mean, I've worked with bodybuilders. I think what they do, they push their body to the limits, but when they jump on stage, they are physically not actually their best. And it's because they are depleting their carbs, that storage, they're decreasing that water weight so that those muscles really pop. So visually it can be really like, oh wow, this person is really muscle, like has tons of muscle. But if you were to ask that person to do anything active on a show day, they're not going to do it. When they step out on that stage, they're feeling probably the worst that they felt in a really long time. And so there really is this balance of how we utilize carbs. And the truth of it is carbs can be muscle sparing because your body does need glycogen. And if your body isn't using stored glycogen, it's going to turn to that lean body mass. So there's that fine line of, yes, you need to eat enough carbs to be able to provide your body with enough energy to do work, but we don't want the excess, because really when it comes to fat and fat storage, it's not that simple equation of carbs equal fat. It's really any excess that you're going to consume is going to lead to fat storage. So it's more about calories total, not just carbs.
And I think that hits on such an important point that it's also our activity level, right? If you're less active, you might need a lower carb ratio because you don't need that readily available energy. However, if you're super active, an endurance athlete, and then you're demonizing carbs, that could really hold you back from seeing the weight loss you want. So it's important that we understand the nuance in some of these statements as well, and when something might work for somebody and when it might not work for somebody.
Yeah, and that is really a huge point. I mean, I've worked with endurance athletes, and one of my first questions I ask them is what's their favorite candy? And people think I'm going to demonize it or say like, hey, you need to cut back on that candy. But actually, I'm looking for what's a quick carb source that you can enjoy, that you're be able to eat easily on a ride or on a run, when you're doing 2+ hours worth of activity. Because for them, we are looking for those simple carbs, and that's actually the healthier route versus someone else, like you said, that may not be as active, that does not need that quick energy source. So it's really about knowing yourself, knowing your activity, knowing your body and what is going to be best for it, not just simply blindly following carbs are bad, I need to avoid all carbs. And I also find that people just don't really understand what actually is a carb, because when we think of carbs, we think bread, we think pasta, we think candy, but it's also going to be in your fruits. It's going to be in your vegetables. You can have carbs that are going to be packaged with a lot of nutrient dense other items like vitamins and minerals.
And then it's key we get those carbs because we need those nutrients. And then also understand that as our needs and goals change, as our body evolves, as our lifestyle changes, we might find that different ratios work. You might find during a weight loss phase, maybe you do go a little lower carb, but then as you transition to maintenance or gaining muscle, you also adjust. So it's not getting this very good or bad view of anything that's so key.
Yes, exactly. Really, the bottom line is carbs aren't inherently bad. Fattening, it's really just going to be the excess calorie intake as a total is going to be what leads to that fat gain.
So myth number 2, hit me with it.
Gluten-free is a healthier carb alternative. It's again, we're kind of staying in the same playing field talking about carbs, but this has been a big thing, I think, in the last 10 years. We've really demonized gluten. And a lot of this kind of comes back to people believe that if they go gluten-free, they're choosing the healthier carb option. And the fact is, oftentimes when gluten is removed from a food source, manufacturers are going to add other items to try and improve the texture and taste. And those other things that are being added are going to be excess sugar, excess salt, excess fats to try and get that correct texture that makes it still palatable for people. So just because it's gluten-free doesn't mean that it's healthier. And oftentimes gluten really is, a lot of people don't actually know that gluten is actually going to be the protein that's actually found in the wheat, barley, rye, whole wheat products. And that's going to be filled with fiber and B vitamins that we do need.
It's one of these things that recently we've demonized something because of one person with a health concern and having to cut it out. And if you have to cut out gluten, yes, 100%. Please do not eat something that is not good for you and your health concerns. But just because it's not right for somebody else doesn't mean that everybody should demonize it. So we have to find what we actually tolerate. And the more diversity we can include because we don't have issues with it, the better off we're truly going to be.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this has come from, too, the fact gluten, when someone used to be diagnosed with a gluten-free diet, it did kind of limit them in their carb choices. But we live in a day and age where anything can be made gluten-free, which is amazing for those that do have that health concern because they really can find an alternative for anything. But now people are using it as a way, again, to kind of demonize carbs and to avoid carbs when they're avoiding something that, one, they don't necessarily need to. So they're making their grocery bill go up because gluten-free products are more expensive. And they frankly tend to be more processed than products with gluten because they have to do that extra work to remove something and add something back in to create the correct texture.
I think it's also key that we recognize that anything that has to be labeled with certain things, it's being labeled with it to market it to some extent. And I know that sounds like weird, but at the same time, something that's just naturally not gluten-free, like a fruit or vegetable, doesn't need that label, right? But any like products that have been processed that have that, they're doing it because they want to attract a market that they think will consume it. So we don't want to fall for terms that are misguided healthy, so to speak, that will sort of make us buy things that aren't necessarily better for our health.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up because it makes me kind of chuckle because I actually recently bought a bag of spinach, and on that bag of spinach it said gluten-free. And spinach is always gluten-free, like unless you've cross-contaminated it by rolling it around in a product that has it's not a concern that you need to have. So it is interesting how, like you said, food owners, food companies, they're latching on to what they see the market is leaning towards, and they're going to start labeling everything, whether it's to be gluten, even if it already wasn't a concern to begin with.
All right, so we have carbs will not make you fat. Just because it's labeled gluten-free doesn't mean it's good for you. Myth number 3.
You can only absorb 30 grams of protein per meal.
I'm so glad you had this one because I always like debunking this one.
And it's one of the biggest myths when it comes to protein intake. A lot of people always say like, oh, you can only absorb about 20 to 30 grams. And that's just absolutely not true. If you weren't able to absorb a food, it's not all of a sudden just sitting inside you. It has to go somewhere. So this kind of gets confused, and where I kind of see where people kind of got this myth and kind of came to this conclusion is they're confusing absorption with muscle building usage. And even then, the 30 grams, I mean, I'm not saying like all of that's going to muscle building, but I'm not saying it's not either. So really the truth is any amount of protein you're eating is going to get absorbed. And when I mean absorbed, it's going to be broken down and taken into your circulatory system to be used throughout your body. Now, if that means if you were to consume 100 grams of protein in a meal, that 100 grams is all going to be absorbed by your body, almost all of it at least. And whether it's all going to be used for muscle building, maybe not, but it's going to be used throughout your body. So a lot of people take this as, Well, if the protein's not going to be used for muscle building, then what's the point? Well, there's so much more to having a higher protein diet than just building muscle. So I really think that's where people kind of latch onto this idea that you shouldn't have more than that. But again, it's also going to depend on the person with how much they're even able to use for building muscle. And part of that's going to be their weight and how much muscle they already currently have in their fitness level.
Not to mention, age impacts how much protein we need, because as we get older and we're less able to utilize it as efficiently, we need that bigger punch to actually get the same benefit. If you time it around your workouts, that can impact the rate of absorption. Not to mention even the other foods you're eating it with. So often we ignore that a lot of those studies that said 20 to 30 grams is like the ideal were done on supplements, not on mixed meals where fat's going to slow the rate of how you're actually digesting and utilizing it. And I also think it's interesting that it gets always brought up with protein, but there's technically an upper limit to every macro where if you don't need it, it's going to go circulate or be gotten rid of from your body, or even stored as fat, yes, if you're over consuming calories overall for the day. But there's so much nuance to it, and your body wants to use what you're giving it as efficiently as possible because it wants to survive.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other thing too is a lot of people are like, well, that's not what the RDA recommends. Well, that RDA level is to avoid major deficiency. It's not to hit and have optimal health. And so it's really to, make sure organs are functioning, you're still surviving. We're not seeing any major detriments from having a lower protein, but that's not saying that that level is the as high as you can go. It's saying that's the bare minimum, like you mentioned. And there, like I said, there are other reasons besides muscle growth to have a higher protein diet. One is it's just going to spare that lean body mass whenever you are in a deficit. It does promote weight loss because it increases satiety, and there's plenty of research out there that it helps with regulating your blood sugar levels, and even this is one that a lot of people don't know, but it even does actually help increase your calcium absorption, which may have long-term improvements for your bone health, which for women, when we hit menopause, we already know it's a little bit harder to gain muscle. We already know our bone health is a little bit at risk of getting that osteoporosis. So those are reasons why we need to focus on a higher protein diet, specifically as a woman.
It's also an interesting thing that when we think about our nutrition and dialing in our diet, there's like an odd safety in going higher protein with weight loss goals, where your calories have to come from somewhere and you need to fuel your actual activity. And because of the higher thermic effect of protein too, you're going to actually utilize more energy to process that into fuel. Not to mention in a deficit, you're not usually getting too much of anything. So we need that extra to build muscle, but it's even that bonus to our metabolic health and that thermic effect that we don't often recognize with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, there's really all these other benefits from having a high protein diet, but everyone tends to focus on the muscle growth aspect when there's so much more to it.
All right. Myth number 4. What is it?
So I could have taken this a couple different ways because I feel like dairy has gotten a bad rap a lot lately, but I decided to focus mainly on the inflammation myth that I've seen a lot, where dairy causes inflammation. And there is a lot of reasons why this came to be and why people do believe this. But one of the big things is it really doesn't have anything to do with dairy itself, but it actually has to do with the saturated fats that can come from higher fat dairy products. But saturated fats are also in lots of other foods. So again, it comes back to, unless you have a medical reason to avoid it, dairy isn't something that you should cut out. And this should really be kind of a blanketed statement for all foods in general, is unless there's a medical reason to avoid a food category, you shouldn't avoid it in its entirety, because we do know variety is important and there's always going to be lots of benefits from consuming that food. For dairy specifically, it's a great protein source. It has that calcium. A lot of it's fortified even with some vitamin D that is hard to come by. So these are all reasons to kind of keep it in your diet. But does it actually have that inflammatory response? No, not unless all of a sudden your saturated fats are kind of through the roof. Then maybe if you overconsume dairy and it's a big source of saturated fats in your diet, then maybe, yeah, we need to cut it back a little bit. But overall, not something you need to cut out in its entirety.
It's also interesting how much we talk about like fruits and vegetables for micronutrient intake, but so many of the foods we eat, like proteins and dairy, for example, have those micronutrients we also need in often different forms than we would get in the plant-based forms. And so by cutting out or restricting whole food groups, not only do we make our life tough and cut out things we enjoy, but we're potentially cutting back on getting nutritional value in different ways that our body actually needs.
There's a lot of research that shows fermented dairy products like yogurt, kefir, those things are actually going to improve your inflammatory response. So you actually have anti-inflammatory effects by making sure you are consuming some of these dairy products.
I also thought it was really amusing when you put this myth, because I know when I first started trying to work towards getting a leaner physique, I had read in some bodybuilding whatever, oh, dairy, don't consume it because it can make you look softer or be inflammatory. And I was like, I always ate dairy, and I included, and I'm like, no, I'm not going to do this, because we do sometimes read something and then all of a sudden you're like, well, if somebody who has the goal that I want, the aesthetic that I want, the health that I want, the lifestyle that I want, well, that must be the case for me too, instead of exploring what our body actually needs.
Yeah, and I think a big thing too is a lot of times the people and the research that may show that there was an effect, for example, saturated fat intake, it's really, well, how much were they eating? Like, it's really about like, well, how much was actually consumed compared to other foods? Because it's really just striking that balance and making sure you are having that variety from all foods. Because like everything, no matter what it is, you can overdo it in one area. And it's going to be the same with dairy products. But if you're consuming the normal, typical amounts, you're not all of a sudden going to have major inflammatory responses to it unless you already have some type of intolerance.
All right. And myth number 5, what is it?
So this really comes from social media because it's a very popular post to see those, what do you eat in a day? But if you are seeing a certain amount of calories someone is consuming, don't automatically assume it's too low, too high, or something that you need to incorporate yourself because that's how you hope to look. And this really comes from the fact that calories from person to person, there's so many factors to it that if you're only seeing their calories, you're only seeing a small part of the story. You don't know how tall this person is, what they weigh, what their goal is, and even things like activity level, fitness level, and even climate can actually affect what someone needs to consume day to day when it comes to calories.
I actually did a post that was that where I was like saying this is a 1600 calorie day of eating with these macros. And in that people would say this is way too high, this is way too low. And I'm like, well, I'm not saying this works for everybody. I'm saying this is what this day would look like. A, B, what I might use. And C, like I found macros make such a big impact. And then even length of time, how you pair the training with it. There's just so many different ways that you can use things that you might not even have thought that could have been too low, like, right? Like I can tell you when I first was trying to like weave my way through all the different data out there to figure out how to get leaner, I would be like, oh, I can't eat that little. I'm starving. And then I realized how much the macros even impacted how like full we feel, the types of foods, the nutrient dense foods that we include, the meal timing. There's just so much nuance to it. And when you see those perspectives, it can be a great starting point. It can give you ideas to help you out. It can encourage you to maybe seek out whether or not you need to eat more or change your macros. But you've ultimately got to start by assessing where you're at currently to know the changes that are right for you, because genetics, previous dieting history, how long you've had the weight on, all these things are going to even come into play, like things we don't consider. Like, right, we say, oh, my goal is fat loss, I'm active, and this, but there's so much else at play.
Yeah, absolutely. And so many, I mean, people just fall victim on social media to be like, oh, they're saying that if they're doing that, then that means I have to do that. But it's really, like you said, this is really just an example of one particular calorie level. And really, I agree with you. It does depend more on what is it going to look like macro-wise? What are those meals going to look like? And is the quality that this person is consuming better? Because I have seen those, this is what I eat in a day. and they eat very little, but then all of a sudden they're like, oh, and I didn't track this, but I also had this amount of caffeine throughout the day. Well, that person is relying on caffeine for the energy to get throughout the day often. But I really do, even as a dietitian in school, I remember being like, no adult female should ever be under 1,200 calories or be at 1,200 calories. That's the amount for a toddler. And that was so ingrained that even to this day, I will see people that will not know anything about the person other than they said that they are consuming 1,200 calories. And even I've seen dietitians be like, no, that's way too low. Well, is that person under 5 feet? Because I've had clients that are not active, that are under 5 feet tall, and a 1,200 calorie diet actually is appropriate for them. And I've had women that have been at 5 feet or close to 5 feet who are consuming over 2,000 calories because their activity level is so high. So you really can't just look at calories alone and automatically know if that person is too low, too high, doing it wrong. And you shouldn't look at anyone's calorie levels and make any assumption unless you are seeing kind of the whole picture in its entirety.
And it's even understanding that some of those calorie levels, if it is a figure or fitness competitor out there, they're potentially doing it for a competition, which is a sport. Someone eating at a specific calorie level who's an endurance athlete is doing it for a sport. So there are even going to be sport-specific things that will impact what they're doing. And as much as we like the idea of a lifestyle and creating something sustainable, there are going to be periods of time where people are doing things that aren't sustainable, but with a purpose. And we don't want to demonize that as well. We want to understand all the nuance to different things and then just search for what actually works for us.
Yeah. And the big thing is don't ever just be like, oh, I want to look like that person. This is how I do it. Because that person's not going to be doing the same thing. And like you said, they may be doing a specific calorie level for a short period of time that may not help you get where you need to go.
And as I tell people all the time when they ask me, like, how did you go from this to this? I'm like, or how long did it take you? I'm like, it took my entire life, because everything you've done in the past will impact the future result you get. And you just have to be aware of that so that you can really make sure that you aren't falling prey to these myths and you're addressing what you actually need to move forward.
Yes, absolutely.
I want to build a lifestyle. This is a phrase that most of us have said. We all do want to find our lifestyle balance when we're making dietary changes, when we're making workout changes. But I think sometimes in saying this, we think we're going to find the thing, one thing we do for the rest of our life. And while we're going to find components of that thing that we build, it's going to be constantly evolving. It's not just set it and forget it. And we have this more when it comes to our nutrition. Like if you really think about your workouts, when was the last time you just did the same workout forever? Most of us haven't. Even if we do workouts for a while, a set progression for a while, at some point we do change, whether or not it's with a change in our schedule, our goals changing, the equipment we have available changing. But most of us do evolve our workouts over time, and we even find it fun to find new things. Yet we have this attitude with our nutrition that we're going to build this lifestyle. It's going to be this one diet. We're going to do it this one way forever. And that's not really how it works. The exact foods we include might change with the seasons, might change with our taste. We might find new recipes because we're getting bored with things. Exact macro breakdowns that we use might change as our body changes, as our goals change, as our lifestyle changes. But basically everything is constantly evolving. And so lifestyle is a very fluid thing. Even what you value or prioritize might shift. If you go from being a single person to being in a relationship, your food prep might shift because now you're prepping for two people. Or if you have a family, your prep might change because of that, or what you even prioritize in terms of how you design your workouts might change because of that. So I think as we try and seek out a sustainable lifestyle, we have to realize that what this really is not finding one habit that we're going to do forever, but underlying foundational principles that we're going to follow. Things we're going to learn about ourselves. Like, are we a person that doesn't do well with saying, I can't have this food? Or are we a person that needs those boundaries of these are the things I do consume, these are the things I don't consume because they don't make me feel as good. But it's finding out who we are, what we need to address, and then always adjusting off of that. For me, it is coming back to macros. I know that if I track, I can always adjust my portions based on what I need at that time. Macro breakdowns that I used in the past, I may never use again. I might come back to them a bazillion times because they are always good. But I know that it's not so much a macro breakdown that I'm always going to return to, but just the fact that I can track to keep myself on track, hold myself accountable, and then adjust, right? So I'm going back to foundational habits, but knowing that the exact implementation might vary. I can go back to specific workout designs while using new movements, right? But it's focusing always on when you're trying to create a sustainable lifestyle, who you are, what you value right now, what your lifestyle is like right now, and then how can you make sure that you're implementing the habits that you actually need? Whether or not it's always going back to the fact that you set things on calendars, that you write out your workouts ahead of time. What are those foundational things that you know you can return to make sure that you're doing the habits that you actually need? But allow yourself to realize that a lifestyle is going to be fluid and that you might even work towards one goal, reach that goal, and then need to tweak. It's not that what you were doing before was bad. It's just that you're evolving, your body is changing, your goals are changing, your priorities changing, your lifestyle is changing, and you need to evolve with it. So don't get stuck in doing one thing. Always be willing to assess. Set those checkpoints even so that you can step back, say, hey, what's working? What could I do even better? How could I simplify things? Heck, how could I be a little bit lazier with things and get the same results? But a sustainable lifestyle isn't doing one thing, it's being willing to constantly learn and evolve. So I want to go over 5 workout myths, 5 exercise myths, 5 training myths that I hear far too often, and why I feel like they came about and even what we should actually be doing about them and why I believe they're myths and not facts. If you are listening, don't forget to check out the YouTube if you do want to see demos of any of the things I'm going over. So number 1, you shouldn't do insert whatever move you've heard here after insert whatever age you've chosen here. Okay, I hear this about all sorts of moves and all sorts of ages. The simple fact of the matter is so often the moves we're demonizing are movement patterns we do in everyday life. And if you don't use it, you'll lose it, okay? The gym is the perfect way to retrain movement patterns we don't know how to control because we are in control of the speed at which we do them and all the other variables. But trying to sit down to something or rotate really quickly in everyday life when you're trying to catch a kid running past you into the street or, catch a falling dish or whatever else, you are then not in control of all the different variables and you need to react quickly. And if you aren't able to control that movement pattern, that's where we get injured reaching really quickly for something on the ground, okay? So you want to think about the gym as this perfect opportunity to retrain movement patterns. If you're learning to try and control rotation, great. Now you can take something and actually learn to power it and go slowly with a cable, or you can do anything you need to learn how to actually control that. Or even trying to avoid unwanted rotation. You could do that stability press, okay? And have that resistance pulling on you and avoid actually twisting with it. But you can train these movement patterns and learn how to protect and engage muscles correctly in the gym. But if you don't use it, you lose it. And I know one of the things we often demonize as we get older, if we've had any aches and pains, especially knee injuries, is jumping type movements. And while no, one move is not right for everybody, sometimes we might not ever build back to specific moves, we don't want to just write them off and we want to see the purpose to even find other ways to implement those techniques. But jumping is so often something we avoid as we get older, but it's really learning how to recruit muscles really efficiently to be that explosive, to even have the proper landing mechanics. So if you step off the curb wrong, you can catch yourself. If you sort of slip on some rocks on a hike, you can catch yourself. So don't be afraid to find ways to really implement that jump training, that explosive training, that reactive training into your routine. And again, how we do it might vary. You might not be able to do jumping just yet, but maybe you do very quick movements, maybe you use the agility ladder, maybe you use some med ball stuff to work on that explosive neuromuscular efficiency. But you want to think about, instead of saying, I can't do X move because I'm X age, how can I train this to really get the full value? Okay? Myth number 2 I hear is squats and lunges are bad for your knees. No move is really bad for you, okay? Improper implementation of an exercise we haven't earned, an exercise that doesn't match our needs and goals, that we don't really know how to do correctly, that we aren't aware of the muscles being engaged correctly, those are moves that are wrong for us, okay? They are not bad moves. But where this demonization of squats and lunges really came from is we started to see people squatting with this movement pattern, okay? So then we started to say that you have to sit back, your knees have to be behind your toes, but this was trying to cue people not to do this where they were overloading their knees. And that's causing overload of your knees, especially if you have any aches and pains because of the pressure on the flexion, okay? Flexion is what our knees are meant to do. They are meant to extend and flex, okay? And so we do want to learn to control that. But if that flexion and that overload of those muscles, they can't handle it, that's what's going to lead to aches and pains. So learning how to, yes, squat correctly and really sit back and load your glutes correctly, make sure that you're controlling the range of motion as you're building up the strength in your quads. And that's where even using something like a bench can really come into play, because you can use something where you're sitting back to it. Not only can that help you sit back a little bit more, okay, but it can help you make sure that you're controlling the range of motion to strengthen your legs correctly. But we want to remember that when we go into a deeper squat, we are actually putting more strain on those quads. We are requiring more mobility out of our knees, and we might not have that yet, okay? We want to do as much as we can to train back to it. If you even are struggling with active knee flexion right now, there are ways to train knee flexion and those squats without movement. Holding, wall sits, they're great, right? We can start with certain things that meet us where we're at to learn how to strengthen the muscles involved. And that whole knee behind toes thing came about because people were walking forward. They didn't necessarily have the ankle mobility to actually load their glutes correctly, and so they were overloading their quads. So even in lunging, if you're finding that you're really going forward onto the ball of your foot, make sure A, you're keeping your heel down. But if you don't have proper ankle mobility, or you have limited ankle mobility for any reason, think about a more vertical shin angle. Think about keeping that knee aligned over that ankle so that you're not stressing it too much and even loading your glutes a little bit better, because that more vertical shin angle allows for more glute loading. You even might want to work with your build and think, hey, can I hinge a little bit more to help load my glutes more versus keeping more of an upright posture, because I also don't have that hip extension of that back leg. But it's not about demonizing moves and saying they're bad. It's about learning the variations of movements that we can include. Maybe it's even doing, again, either that squat hold, or maybe you do an anterior reach lunge where you use more of that hip hinge, less knee flexion, because you can't yet control it, because you don't yet have that strength, or because you don't yet have the mobility for any reason due to a previous injury. So instead of just saying they're bad for your knees, learn to control the lunge and squat as much as you can, because we do those movements so often in everyday life, and they're fundamental movement patterns we need to learn to train, okay? But use the variation that's right for you as you do the other mobility work you need to even try and build back as much as possible. But you might find doing that hold, slowly you're able to get lower. Using that bench, slowly you're able to get lower as you focus on what you actually feel working during the movement and get the correct muscles working. The other move that I often hear demonized is the deadlift. They're bad for your back. You shouldn't deadlift over the age of, I don't know, I've heard of a variety of different ages, but you shouldn't deadlift. Okay, the deadlift is one of the most fundamental movement patterns. It is the hip hinge movement pattern. It is this, okay? The problem is that a lot of us, when we deadlift or we do this hip hinge, we don't actually hinge at the hips. We just lean and round forward. And when that happens, all of our weight goes forward. So if you are reaching for something on the ground and your weight is all going forward and you're reaching out, guess what? It's harder on your abs to protect in that extended, basically plank position, okay? If you actually do an extended plank where you're walking back out, that plank position is way harder on your abs and a great way to actually work your lower abs. But that extended plank position needs to be used strategically where you can brace. So when you're doing that and you're rocking forward because you're leaning over versus actually hinging at the hips correctly, you're going to end up overloading your lower back. It's why when people deadlift with the barbell, they can often end up with back pain if they haven't trained it correctly, because A, you've got to kind of scrape it up your shins to keep it close. But B, this is also why potentially using something like dumbbells or kettlebells can be a great way to train this movement pattern as you build up, because you can actually set the weight back towards your heels, which makes sure that you're not reaching out. Okay, so it's knowing why can overload occur. It's because you're not engaging your lats. It's because you're not loading your glutes. So even if you struggle with the hip hinge movement pattern, think about sitting back to a wall. That sitting back to the wall, make sure that you're actually pushing your butt back to load versus reaching forward. And then use tools that allow you to actually assist in sitting back, keeping the weight close so that you're not reaching out. You can engage those lats to even keep that tension because your back is supporting that movement. But learn to control it, breaking it down as you need, going back to the wall variation to build up. Again, not every variation of a movement pattern will be right for every person. You might decide you're never going to barbell deadlift, and that is A-okay, but learn to control the movement pattern as much as you can, because if you don't learn how to do that hip hinge, you're going to be reaching for a box on the ground and hurt your back, okay? We want to see the gym as an opportunity to train ourselves to move well and use the correct muscles as efficiently as possible to avoid injury in everyday life, okay? Number 4, I'm injured, I need to rest, okay? So we've talked about the squats and lunges being bad for your knees. We've talked about deadlifts being bad for your back. We've talked about not doing X movement after X age. The other thing I hear is I'm injured, I need to rest. And while yes, sometimes we do need to take time off with injuries, so often we just don't do anything, and that doesn't really help us heal any faster. Not to mention, resting does absolutely nothing to correct the underlying problem. So with injuries, you might have to rest the area. You might have to avoid and work around the area. But as soon as you can, you want to learn how to retrain all the movements that joint, that muscle does, because the more you can retrain those movement patterns, the more you can make sure that you're not overloading the area. If you've had a shoulder injury, assess why that has happened. You might have to go see someone to get assessed, but assess, hey, is it actually the shoulder's fault? Or did I have immobility at my wrist, which was creating overload? Especially with our elbow, if there's wrist or shoulder immobility, we can get overload there. But you want to break things down and learn how you can actually control the movement patterns that created the injury, but also assess the mobility restrictions that might have caused it, okay? So instead of just resting, you got to do that rehab work. That rehab is so key because a lot of times shoulder, it's spinal mobility, it's scapular control, and you can do so many of those things to train those areas as you're even resting the area that needs to be rested. So yes, you might need to avoid specific movements or really regress specific movements to learn how to control them, but do the rehab to address the underlying culprit, okay? You can't just rest and come back to what you were doing because you're never gonna change the movement patterns that way. The final tip I wanted to go over is, I don't have enough time, or you can basically insert any excuse you want here, but I don't have enough time, okay? So many of the excuses we make are because we're not owning our priorities. We're not designing for the time we have, our realistic schedule. We're trying to fit some ideal, okay? I hear I don't have enough time all the time, and I'm like, well, when was the last time you just tried to do 3 days a week? Or design workouts for 5 minutes, 5 days a week, right? Often our answer is never, because we're like, well, what will that even do? Something is better than nothing, and it's gonna get us in a routine. And we're saying we don't have enough time because we're trying to shoot for some ideal that we have in our head. So instead, design for the time you have so you can be consistent, because designing for 3 days a week and staying consistent for 3 days a week is gonna add up a lot more than designing a body part split for 6 days a week where you get in legs one day and biceps the other day, but you miss all the other workouts. You're missing all those other body parts, right? So if you design for the time you have, you can be really strategic and see the best results. So when it comes to excuses, assess, why am I making this excuse? Why do I feel I need this time, or I need to do this type of meal prep, or I need to do this one thing? Think about your priorities and then plan the best ways to work around them, okay? Because that's gonna help you see the best results from your nutrition and from your workouts. So that one's not even just a workout one, but time is one of the big ones with workouts that I do here. And just remember that something is better than nothing. You can literally design for 5 minutes to be incredibly torturous and help you see amazing results in terms of building up that foundation so that when you do have more time, you can get back to more intensive training. But don't let these myths hold you back. Guys, question so many of the things you're being told and really assess what you need, always staying focused on meeting your body where you're at. There isn't just one right move, one right workout design. There's so much opportunity, but you need to assess your previous training experience, where you're at right now, and your priorities to make sure that you're always training with intentionality and not just focus on working harder, but actually training smarter. Well, that's a wrap for this episode of the Fitness Hacks Podcast. Hopefully there were some helpful tips to debunk those exercise and diet myths to get you guys moving forward.